Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we are descending into the most disturbing true encounters that took place within cemetery grounds across America, with 10 most disturbing true cemetery horror stories. These chilling accounts have been gathered from night shift workers, grieving visitors, and security personnel who witnessed events among the headstones that defied all rational explanation. Each story represents a genuine encounter with forces that should have remained buried, documented by individuals whose lives were forever altered by what they experienced in these sacred grounds. The testimonies you will hear tonight come directly from police reports, witness statements, and first-hand accounts that have been carefully verified through multiple sources. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily authentic horror content that exposes the terrifying truth lurking in our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unveil the darkness that surrounds us. Now, let us walk through the iron gates of America's most haunted burial grounds, where the dead do not always rest in peace, and the living discover that some encounters follow you home long after you leave the cemetery behind. Our first disturbing encounter takes us to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, where 22-year-old photography student Jackson discovered that some voices from beyond the grave are not meant to be answered. What began as an innocent night photography assignment would transform into a terrifying encounter that left investigators baffled, and Jackson forever changed. Jackson had always been drawn to the haunting beauty of old cemeteries. As a junior at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, he specialized in capturing the ethereal quality of moonlight dancing across weathered headstones and ancient mausoleums. His portfolio was filled with stunning black and white images that seemed to capture the very essence of mortality itself. His professors praised his unique ability to find beauty in places others considered morbid, and his work had even caught the attention of several prominent galleries in the city. On the night of October 15th, 2023, Jackson received what seemed like the perfect assignment. His advanced photography course required students to capture a series of images that told a story about the relationship between light and shadow in urban environments. While his classmates planned to photograph skyscrapers and street scenes, Jackson knew exactly where he wanted to go. Woodlawn Cemetery, established in 1863, sprawled across 400 acres and contained some of the most elaborate Victorian-era monuments in the Northeast. The cemetery was home to the graves of countless notable figures, but what drew Jackson was the way moonlight transformed the landscape into something otherworldly. Jackson had photographed at Woodlawn several times before during daylight hours, always receiving permission from the administration office. However, for this particular assignment, he needed to capture the interplay between artificial lighting and natural moonlight, which meant he would need to work after the cemetery's official closing time. Rather than risk being turned away, Jackson decided to enter through a section of the perimeter fence that he had noticed was partially concealed by overgrown vegetation during his previous visits. On that crisp autumn evening, Jackson packed his camera equipment into a weatherproof bag and made his way to the cemetery around 11 p.m. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a silvery glow that seemed to make the marble monuments glow from within. He had specifically chosen this date because the weather forecast promised clear skies and minimal cloud cover. As he slipped through the gap in the fence, Jackson felt the familiar thrill of being somewhere he was not supposed to be, combined with the artistic excitement of capturing something truly unique. The cemetery at night was a completely different world from the peaceful place he had visited during the day. Shadows seemed deeper and more mysterious, and every sound was amplified in the stillness. The gentle rustling of leaves in the October breeze created an almost musical backdrop as Jackson made his way deeper into the cemetery grounds. He had planned his route carefully, targeting a section of the cemetery that contained some of the most ornate mausoleums and monuments, where the contrast between light and shadow would be most dramatic. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded exactly as Jackson had hoped. His camera captured stunning images of moonlight filtering through the bare branches of ancient oak trees, casting intricate patterns across marble angels and elaborate headstones. The digital display on his camera showed image after image of haunting beauty. He photographed the Gothic Revival architecture of the larger mausoleums, their stone gargoyles seeming to come alive in the shifting shadows. The ornate ironwork of cemetery gates created fascinating geometric patterns when backlit by distant streetlights that filtered through the trees from the surrounding neighborhood. As Jackson worked his way through the older section of the cemetery, he came across an area that seemed particularly rich with photographic opportunities. This section contained graves dating back to the 1870s, and many of the headstones bore intricate carved details that created fascinating textures in the moonlight. The monuments here were taller and more elaborate than in other sections, with several impressive family mausoleums that rose like small temples from the earth. It was just after 1 a.m. when Jackson heard the first voice. He was crouched beside an ornate headstone, adjusting his camera settings to capture the delicate details carved into the weathered granite, when he heard someone calling his name from somewhere behind him. The voice was faint but unmistakable, carried on the gentle night breeze. What made Jackson freeze in place was not just that someone knew his name, but the voice itself. It was the voice of his grandfather, who had passed away 3 years earlier. Jackson's grandfather, Robert, had been his closest family member and greatest supporter of his artistic pursuits. Robert had been a photographer himself during his younger years, and he had given Jackson his first camera when he turned 16. The old man had spent countless hours teaching Jackson about composition, lighting, and the technical aspects of photography. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack during Jackson's freshman year of college, the loss had been devastating. The voice calling his name was unmistakably Robert's distinctive gravelly tone, the same voice that had encouraged him through every challenge and celebrated every artistic achievement. Jackson stood slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped his camera. The logical part of his mind knew that what he was hearing was impossible. His grandfather was buried in a small cemetery in upstate New York, more than 200 miles away. There was no rational explanation for hearing his voice in this place, yet the voice came again, clearer this time, calling his name with the same affectionate tone Robert had always used. "Jackson, come here, boy. I want to show you something." The voice seemed to be coming from deeper within the cemetery, from an area that Jackson had not yet explored. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave immediately, Jackson found himself walking toward the sound. His grandfather had never steered him wrong in life, and even though this situation defied all logic, some part of him felt compelled to follow. The voice continued to call to him intermittently as he walked, always staying just far enough ahead that he could not see its source. As Jackson followed the voice deeper into the cemetery, he began to notice that something was fundamentally wrong with the landscape around him. The moonlight, which had been bright and clear throughout the evening, seemed to be growing dimmer, despite the fact that no clouds had appeared to block it. The shadows between the monuments were becoming deeper and more impenetrable, and the familiar sounds of the night had faded to an unnatural silence. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air had become thick and heavy. The voice of his grandfather continued to guide him through winding paths between increasingly elaborate monuments. Jackson realized that he had wandered into a section of the cemetery that he'd never seen before, even during his daytime visits. The architecture of the mausoleums here was different, older, and more ornate than anything else in Woodlawn. The headstones bore dates going back to the 1840s, and many of the inscriptions were in languages he could not identify. Some of the monuments seemed to incorporate symbols and imagery that did not match any religious tradition he recognized. As Jackson continued to follow his grandfather's voice, he began to feel an overwhelming sense of unease that went beyond the natural nervousness of being in a cemetery alone at night. The temperature seemed to be dropping rapidly, and his breath was beginning to form visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. His camera equipment, which had been functioning perfectly all evening, began to malfunction. The LCD screen flickered intermittently, and the autofocus system made strange clicking sounds as it struggled to lock onto subjects. The voice of his grandfather called out once more, this time from directly ahead. Jackson could see a large mausoleum looming in the darkness, its elaborate Gothic architecture more imposing than any of the other structures he had encountered. As he approached, he realized that the voice was coming from inside the mausoleum itself. The heavy bronze doors stood slightly ajar, and a faint, sickly sweet odor emanated from within. The smell was unlike anything Jackson had ever encountered, simultaneously floral and putrid, as if something beautiful had been left to rot. Standing before the entrance to the mausoleum, Jackson finally understood that he was in terrible danger. The voice, calling to him, might sound like his beloved grandfather, but Robert would never have led him to such a place. His grandfather had been a practical man who believed in protecting those he loved from harm. Whatever was calling to him from within that stone tomb was not Robert, despite how perfectly it mimicked his voice and mannerisms. Jackson turned to run, but as he did, the voice changed. What had been warm and familiar became cold and predatory. The thing inside the mausoleum began to laugh with his grandfather's voice, but the laughter was wrong, filled with malice and hunger. As Jackson stumbled away from the mausoleum, he could hear movement from within, as if something large was shifting among the stone sarcophagi. In his panic to escape, Jackson lost his bearings completely. The cemetery paths that had seemed familiar earlier in the evening now appeared to lead in impossible directions. Every turn seemed to bring him deeper into the older section of the cemetery, no matter which direction he chose. The voice of his grandfather continued to call out from different locations, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind, always with that same terrible laughter underneath the familiar words. Jackson ran blindly through the cemetery for what felt like hours, his camera equipment forgotten, as his only thought was to find the exit. The landscape around him had become completely alien, filled with monuments and mausoleums that seemed to shift and change when he was not looking directly at them. The moonlight had faded to almost nothing, leaving him to navigate by the faint glow of distant streetlights that seemed impossibly far away. It was nearly dawn when Jackson finally found himself back at the section of fence where he had entered the cemetery. He had no memory of how he had gotten there or how much time had passed since he began running. His camera was missing, and his clothes were torn and dirty as if he had been crawling through thorns and underbrush. Most disturbing of all, he had no photographs from the evening except for the images he had captured during the first 2 hours, before he heard his grandfather's voice. When Jackson reported his experience to the police the following day, they initially treated it as a case of trespassing and possible drug use. However, when cemetery security reviewed the footage from their surveillance cameras, they found something that changed their perspective entirely. The cameras showed Jackson entering the cemetery and moving through the grounds for approximately 2 hours, exactly as he had described. But then, at the point where he claimed to have heard his grandfather's voice, the cameras showed him standing motionless in one location for nearly 4 hours, apparently staring at something beyond the range of the camera's view. More disturbing was what the cameras revealed about Jackson's behavior during those 4 hours. The footage showed him occasionally responding to something off-camera, nodding and gesturing as if engaged in conversation with an invisible companion. At several points, he appeared to be following someone, or something, that was not visible on any of the camera feeds. The security office confirmed that no other individuals had entered the cemetery that night, and motion sensors throughout the grounds had detected no movement other than Jackson's. When police retrieved Jackson's camera from the location where the security footage showed him standing motionless, they discovered that it contained hundreds of photographs taken during the missing 4 hours. However, every single image was completely black, as if the camera had been unable to capture any light despite the clear moonlight visible in the security footage. The camera itself showed no signs of malfunction when tested by technicians. The investigation into Jackson's experience ultimately remained unsolved. Medical examinations revealed no traces of drugs or alcohol in his system, and psychological evaluations found no evidence of mental illness or hallucinations. Cemetery records showed no graves belonging to anyone named Robert in the section where Jackson claimed to have heard his grandfather's voice. And historical research revealed that the mausoleums in that area had been sealed for decades due to structural instability. Jackson never returned to cemetery photography after that night. He transferred to a different program at his college and eventually abandoned photography altogether. According to those who knew him, he never spoke about what happened during those missing 4 hours, beyond insisting that whatever had called to him using his grandfather's voice was still waiting in that mausoleum for the next person foolish enough to follow it into the darkness. Our second encounter takes us to Riverside Memorial Cemetery in Salem, Oregon, where groundskeeper Camden learned that the creatures stalking the graveyard after midnight were far more dangerous than any wild animal he had ever encountered. What began as routine night maintenance would reveal a terrifying truth about the things that hunt among the headstones when darkness falls. 28-year-old Camden had worked the night shift at Riverside Memorial for nearly 3 years when the incidents began in late November of 2022. The cemetery, established in 1893, covered over 200 acres of rolling hills overlooking the Willamette River. During his time there, Camden had developed a deep respect for the peaceful nature of his work environment. Unlike his previous jobs in construction and warehouse work, the cemetery offered him solitude and a sense of purpose that he found deeply satisfying. His responsibilities included maintaining the grounds, ensuring security, and performing minor repairs to monuments and infrastructure that could not be completed during visiting hours. Camden had always been comfortable working alone in the cemetery at night. He appreciated the quiet dignity of the place and felt honored to serve as its guardian during the vulnerable overnight hours. The cemetery's management had hired him specifically because of his military background and his comfort with solitary work environments. His service record from 2 tours in Afghanistan had demonstrated his ability to remain calm and alert during long periods of isolation, skills that translated perfectly to cemetery security work. The first unusual incident occurred on a foggy Tuesday night in late November. Camden was conducting his routine perimeter check around 2 a.m. when he heard what sounded like a pack of coyotes moving through the newer section of the cemetery. Oregon had experienced an increase in urban coyote populations in recent years, and cemetery management had briefed all staff about the possibility of encounters with wildlife. The animals were generally harmless to humans, but could potentially disturb funeral services or damage landscaping if they became too comfortable in the area. What caught Camden's attention about these particular sounds was their unusual nature. The vocalizations he heard were unlike typical coyote calls, which he recognized from his childhood spent in rural Oregon. These sounds were more complex and seemed to contain an almost conversational quality, as if the animals were communicating in a sophisticated manner. The calls also seemed to be coming from multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting a larger pack than was typical for urban coyotes. Over the following weeks, Camden began to notice other signs of unusual animal activity throughout the cemetery. He discovered tracks in soft soil near several grave sites that were larger than typical coyote prints and showed an unusual gait pattern. The impressions suggested animals that were significantly heavier than normal coyotes, and some of the tracks appeared to show the animals walking on their hind legs for extended distances. More disturbing were the areas where grass and vegetation had been trampled in circular patterns around certain graves, as if animals had been performing some kind of ritualistic behavior. Camden reported these observations to cemetery management, who initially dismissed them as evidence of larger-than-average coyotes that had found the cemetery to be a safe territory. They recommended that he carry an air horn to scare away any animals he encountered, and assured him that the situation would be monitored. However, management seemed reluctant to invest in additional security measures or wildlife removal services, citing budget constraints and the relatively minor nature of the problem. The situation escalated dramatically on the night of December 15th, when Camden encountered the creatures directly for the first time. He was performing maintenance on a section of decorative fencing near the cemetery's eastern boundary when he heard movement in the darkness beyond his work lights. Assuming it was the same pack of coyotes he had been tracking, Camden grabbed his flashlight and air horn to encourage the animals to move along. What he saw when his flashlight beam cut through the darkness was something that his mind initially refused to accept. 3 figures were moving between the headstones approximately 50 yards away from his position. At first glance, they appeared to be people crouched low to the ground, possibly vandals or trespassers attempting to avoid detection. However, as Camden observed their movement patterns, he realized that these figures were moving in a manner that was fundamentally wrong for human beings. The figures appeared to be traveling on all fours, but their proportions were incorrect for any 4-legged animal he had ever seen. Their limbs seemed too long and thin, and they moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. Most disturbing of all, when one of the figures briefly rose to what appeared to be a standing position, Camden could see that its silhouette was distinctly humanoid despite its animal-like behavior. Camden's military training had taught him to remain calm and assess threats methodically, but what he was witnessing challenged every framework he had for understanding dangerous situations. He activated his radio to contact cemetery security, but discovered that he was receiving only static. His cell phone showed no signal despite being in an area where he normally had full coverage. The isolation that he had always appreciated about his work environment suddenly felt like a potentially fatal vulnerability. As Camden watched, the figures began to move closer to his position. Their approach was deliberate and coordinated, suggesting intelligence and planning rather than random animal behavior. He could hear them making sounds that were neither fully human nor fully animal, vocalizations that seemed to contain elements of both human speech and predatory growling. The sounds were coming from throats that seemed capable of producing a wider range of tones than either humans or animals should possess. When the creatures moved close enough for Camden's flashlight to illuminate them clearly, he saw details that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The figures were wearing what appeared to be human faces, but the faces were wrong in subtle ways that made them fall squarely into the uncanny valley. The proportions were slightly off. The expressions were too rigid, and the eyes reflected light in a manner that was distinctly non-human. Their bodies appeared to be covered in a combination of human skin and coarse dark fur, creating a patchwork appearance that was deeply disturbing to observe. Most terrifying of all was the realization that the faces the creatures wore were familiar. Camden recognized them as belonging to people whose funeral services he had attended during his time working at the cemetery. The creatures were wearing the faces of the recently deceased, somehow incorporating the physical features of people who had been buried in the very ground they now stalked. Camden's survival instincts finally overcame his paralysis, and he began to retreat toward the maintenance building where he could secure himself and attempt to contact help. However, as he moved, he realized that the creatures had anticipated his route and were positioning themselves to cut off his escape. Their movements demonstrated a level of tactical thinking that was far beyond what any animal should possess, and their coordination suggested a pack intelligence that was genuinely terrifying. The chase that followed lasted for nearly an hour, with Camden using every piece of cover available in the cemetery to avoid direct confrontation with the creatures. His military experience proved invaluable as he moved from headstone to mausoleum, always keeping barriers between himself and his pursuers. The creatures seemed to be toying with him rather than making a serious attempt at capture, suggesting that they were either confident in their to eventually corner him or were deriving some kind of entertainment from the pursuit. Throughout the chase, Camden could hear the creatures mimicking human voices, calling out to him using the voices of his deceased family members and friends. They spoke in perfect replications of his grandmother's voice, his high school friend who had died in a car accident, and even his former commanding officer who had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan. The voices pleaded with him to stop running, promising safety and reunion if he would only come to them willingly. As dawn approached, the creatures' behavior began to change dramatically. Their movements became more frantic and less coordinated, as if they were operating under some kind of time constraint. The vocalizations that had been so eerily human throughout the night became increasingly animalistic, eventually degenerating into purely bestial sounds. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the cemetery's trees, the creatures retreated rapidly toward the older section of the grounds, disappearing among monuments that dated back to the cemetery's founding. Camden remained hidden until full daylight before emerging from his shelter behind a large mausoleum. When he finally felt safe enough to investigate the areas where the creatures had been active, he found evidence that convinced him he had not been hallucinating. The soft earth around several graves showed clear tracks from creatures that moved sometimes on 4 legs and sometimes on 2. More disturbing were the areas where the grass had been worn away in patterns that suggested the creatures had been digging, though whatever they had been searching for appeared to have eluded them. When cemetery management arrived for the day shift, they found Camden waiting for them in the parking lot with his resignation letter already prepared. His official report described the incident as an encounter with unusually large and aggressive coyotes that had made him realize he was not suited for isolated night work. However, unofficial conversations with trusted co-workers revealed the true nature of what he had experienced, though few believed his account. The cemetery hired a new night groundskeeper within 2 weeks, but the position experienced unusual turnover over the following months. 3 different employees quit after reporting encounters with unusual wildlife, and 1 was hospitalized after suffering what appeared to be claw marks from an unknown animal. Cemetery management eventually decided to eliminate the overnight groundskeeper position entirely, citing budget concerns and the installation of improved security systems. Camden relocated to Portland and found work in commercial landscaping, deliberately choosing employment that kept him working during daylight hours. According to former co-workers, he became obsessively interested in Native American folklore and spent considerable time researching historical accounts of creatures that could take human form. He reportedly contacted several tribal elders in the Pacific Northwest, though none were willing to discuss his experiences in detail. Local paranormal investigators who learned of Camden's account attempted to visit Riverside Memorial for their own overnight investigations, but cemetery management refused all requests for after-hours access. Security cameras installed throughout the grounds captured numerous instances of unusual movement patterns at night, but management maintains that the footage shows nothing more than local wildlife in unusual lighting conditions caused by fog and shadows. The creatures that Camden encountered have not been positively identified by any wildlife expert who has reviewed his testimony. However, several regional folklore experts have noted similarities between his description and historical accounts of skinwalkers, shape-shifting entities from Native American tradition that are said to wear the forms of both animals and humans for predatory purposes. These experts note that the area where Riverside Memorial was established was historically significant to several Pacific Northwest tribes, though specific details about its ceremonial importance remain closely guarded by tribal authorities. Our third terrifying encounter takes us to the remote wilderness of northern Montana, where 19-year-old college student Princeton discovered that some camping trips lead to encounters with ancient evils that should never be disturbed. What began as an innocent weekend getaway would become a nightmare that revealed the deadly consequences of setting up camp too close to sacred burial grounds. Princeton was a sophomore at Montana State University studying anthropology with a focus on Native American cultures. He had always been fascinated by the rich history of indigenous peoples in the American West, and his academic interests had led him to spend considerable time researching the traditional territories and sacred sites of various Montana tribes. Unlike many of his classmates who approached these subjects from a purely academic perspective, Princeton felt a deep respect for the spiritual significance of the places he studied. In early September 2023, Princeton planned a solo camping trip to a remote area in the Bitterroot Mountains that he had discovered during his research into historical Salish territories. The location was several miles from any marked trails or established campgrounds, accessible only by a challenging hike through dense forest terrain. According to his historical research, the area had been used by indigenous peoples for centuries as both a seasonal hunting ground and a burial site for tribal members who had died during winter camps. Princeton had chosen this location specifically because of its historical significance and its isolation from modern development. He wanted to experience the landscape as it might have appeared to the indigenous peoples who had lived there for generations before European colonization. His plan was to spend 3 days camping in the area, conducting informal archaeological observations and documenting any visible evidence of historical indigenous presence. What Princeton had not fully understood from his academic research was that the area he had chosen contained an active burial ground that was still considered sacred by descendant communities. The historical documents he had consulted were incomplete and had not conveyed the spiritual significance that the location continued to hold for modern tribal members. More importantly, his research had not included any warnings about the protective entities that local tribes believed guarded such sacred sites. Princeton arrived at the trailhead on a Friday afternoon in early September, carrying a backpack loaded with camping gear and research materials. The hike to his chosen campsite took nearly 4 hours through increasingly wild terrain that showed no signs of recent human presence. The forest was dominated by ancient ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, some of which were clearly several hundred years old. The understory was thick with native vegetation, and Princeton observed several species of plants that he recognized from his ethnobotany studies as having traditional medicinal and ceremonial uses. When Princeton finally reached the area where he planned to establish his campsite, he was struck by the unusual atmosphere of the location. The forest seemed unusually quiet, with none of the typical sounds of birds or small animals that he had heard during his approach. The silence was so complete that even his own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as he moved through the undergrowth. The air felt heavy and still, despite a gentle breeze that he could see moving the upper branches of the surrounding trees. The terrain in this area was characterized by a series of low hills covered with dense forest, interspersed with small clearings that appeared to be natural meadows. Princeton chose to set up his tent in one of these clearings, thinking that it would provide him with a good vantage point for observing the surrounding landscape and conducting his informal research. As he began to clear a level area for his tent, he discovered that the soil contained numerous small stones that appeared to have been deliberately arranged in patterns. At first, Princeton assumed that these stone arrangements were natural geological formations, or perhaps evidence of historical logging activity. However, as he examined them more carefully, he realized that the patterns were too regular and intentional to have been created by natural processes. The stones appeared to form rough circles and lines that radiated outward from several central points throughout the clearing. Some of the arrangements incorporated larger rocks that showed evidence of deliberate shaping or carving, though the markings were too weathered to interpret clearly. Princeton's anthropological training taught him to recognize potential archaeological significance when he encountered it, and he realized that he might have discovered evidence of historical indigenous activity that had not been previously documented by academic researchers. He carefully photographed the stone arrangements from multiple angles and took detailed notes about their positioning and apparent relationships to natural landmarks in the area. As Princeton worked to document his discoveries, he began to notice other unusual features of the landscape that suggested long-term human presence. Several of the larger trees bore scars that appeared to be deliberately created bark peeling, a practice that some indigenous groups had used to harvest inner bark for food and medicine. More significantly, he discovered what appeared to be intentional clearings in the forest canopy that would have allowed for specific astronomical observations, suggesting that the area might have been used for ceremonial purposes related to seasonal cycles. Princeton set up his camp with growing excitement about the potential significance of his discovery. He spent the first evening documenting everything he could observe and making detailed sketches of the stone arrangements and their relationships to natural features. His academic training had taught him the importance of thorough documentation when encountering potentially significant archaeological sites, and he wanted to ensure that he could provide detailed information to his professors and appropriate tribal authorities when he returned to campus. The first sign that something was wrong came during Princeton's first night in the camp. He was awakened around 2 a.m. by sounds that initially seemed like wind moving through the trees, but which gradually resolved into something that sounded almost like human voices, speaking in a language he did not recognize. The voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an echo effect that made it impossible to determine their exact source or distance. Princeton lay still in his tent, listening carefully to try to understand what he was hearing. The voices seemed to be engaged in some kind of conversation or chant, with multiple speakers responding to each other in rhythmic patterns. The language was unlike anything he had encountered in his studies of indigenous languages, featuring tonal qualities and sound combinations that seemed to require vocal capabilities beyond normal human ranges. As the night progressed, the voices were joined by other sounds that Princeton could not identify. He heard what sounded like footsteps moving around the perimeter of his campsite, but the pattern of the steps was wrong for human locomotion. The steps seemed too widely spaced and occurred in groups of 4 or 6, rather than the alternating pattern of human walking. More disturbing were periodic sounds that resembled human speech, but were distorted in ways that made them incomprehensible and deeply unsettling. Princeton remained in his tent throughout the night, afraid to investigate the source of the sounds, but too frightened to sleep. His anthropological training had included some exposure to accounts of spiritual experiences and protective practices associated with sacred sites, and he was beginning to suspect that he had unknowingly established his camp in a location that was still actively protected by spiritual guardians. When dawn finally arrived, Princeton emerged from his tent to find that his campsite had been subtly altered during the night. Items that he had carefully organized around his camp had been moved or rearranged in ways that seemed deliberate, but served no obvious practical purpose. His camera, which he had left on a flat rock, had been moved to a different location and positioned to face one of the stone arrangements he had been documenting. Most disturbing of all, new stone patterns had appeared overnight in areas where Princeton was certain no such arrangements had existed the previous day. Princeton spent the morning documenting these changes and trying to understand what had happened during the night. His photographs from the previous day clearly showed the original state of his campsite, providing objective evidence that significant alterations had occurred while he slept. The new stone arrangements were more complex and precise than the weathered patterns he had discovered initially, suggesting that whatever had created them possessed both intelligence and detailed knowledge of the symbolic meanings behind the formations. Despite his growing unease, Princeton decided to remain for the second night of his planned camping trip. His academic curiosity outweighed his fear, and he wanted to gather as much documentation as possible about what appeared to be ongoing spiritual activity at the site. He prepared more carefully for the second night, positioning his camera to record whatever might happen, and ensuring that his documentation materials were securely stored. The second night was far more intense than the first. The voices began earlier, starting just after sunset, and seemed to be coming from locations much closer to Princeton's tent. The sounds were joined by what appeared to be drumming, though the rhythm was unlike any traditional drumming patterns that Princeton recognized from his studies. The drum beats seemed to emanate from the ground itself rather than from any visible source, creating vibrations that Princeton could feel through his sleeping bag. Around midnight, Princeton began to see movement outside his tent. Shapes moved between the trees surrounding his campsite, silhouettes that appeared to be humanoid, but wrong in subtle ways that made them deeply disturbing to observe. The figures seemed to be wearing clothing or decorations that incorporated elements taken from the cemetery that lay hidden deeper in the forest, garments that appeared to be made from materials that should not exist in the natural world. As Princeton watched through the mesh window of his tent, he realized that the figures were conducting some kind of ceremony around the stone arrangements he had discovered. They moved in coordinated patterns between the various stone circles, performing actions that appeared to be ritual in nature. Most terrifying of all, some of the figures appeared to be wearing faces that looked human, but were clearly not attached to living people. The ceremony continued throughout the night, with the figures occasionally approaching Princeton's tent, as if examining him, but never attempting to interact directly. Their faces, when visible in the moonlight, appeared to incorporate features from multiple different people, creating composite visages that were recognizably human but fundamentally wrong. The expressions on these faces cycled through emotions in ways that seemed disconnected from any natural human behavior. When morning came, Princeton found his campsite completely transformed. The stone arrangements had been expanded into an elaborate pattern that incorporated his tent as a central element. New stones had been placed to create pathways leading from his campsite deeper into the forest, toward areas that his maps indicated contained the main burial sites. Most disturbing of all, Princeton discovered that his own belongings had been incorporated into the stone arrangements, positioned as if they were offerings or ritual objects. Princeton packed his equipment as quickly as possible and began the hike back to his vehicle. However, as he attempted to leave the area, he discovered that the landscape had changed in ways that made navigation extremely difficult. Trails that had been clearly marked during his approach seemed to have disappeared or relocated, and his compass readings were inconsistent with his maps. The forest itself seemed to have rearranged to prevent his departure, creating obstacles and confusion that kept him moving in circles despite his careful attention to navigation. It took Princeton nearly 8 hours to complete what should have been a 4-hour hike back to the trailhead. Throughout his journey, he continued to hear voices calling to him from the forest, using words in languages he did not understand, but tones that clearly conveyed threats and warnings. The figures he had observed during the night appeared periodically at the edges of his vision, always maintaining distance but clearly monitoring his progress. Princeton never reported his experiences to academic authorities, recognizing that his unauthorized research on sacred tribal lands could result in serious legal and professional consequences. However, he did eventually contact tribal cultural preservation offices to report the location and request guidance about appropriate protocols for the site. Tribal representatives confirmed that the area Princeton had visited was indeed an active burial ground and ceremonial site that remained under spiritual protection. Princeton changed his academic focus following his camping experience, transferring to a different program that did not require field research in potentially sensitive cultural sites. According to his former classmates, he became intensely interested in traditional protocols for approaching sacred sites and spent considerable time learning about proper procedures for requesting permission from tribal authorities before conducting any research in indigenous territories. Our fourth disturbing encounter takes us to Greenwood Cemetery in Detroit, Michigan, where night security guard J.C. Ahn uncovered a human trafficking operation that used the sacred grounds of the dead as temporary holding facilities for the living. What began as routine security rounds would expose a criminal network that had been operating in plain sight among the mausoleums and monuments for months. 34-year-old J.C. Ahn had been working private security for over a decade when he accepted the position at Greenwood Cemetery in March of 2023. The cemetery, established in 1847, covered 300 acres in downtown Detroit and contained some of the most elaborate Victorian-era monuments in the Midwest. Unlike his previous assignments, protecting corporate buildings and retail establishments, the cemetery offered J.C. Ahn a peaceful work environment that he found deeply satisfying after years of dealing with aggressive crowds and potential violence. J.C. Ahn had been hired specifically because of his military police background and his experience with complex security systems. Greenwood Cemetery had been experiencing minor vandalism and theft issues, and management wanted a security professional who could both deter criminal activity and maintain the dignified atmosphere that families expected when visiting their loved ones. His responsibilities included monitoring surveillance cameras, conducting hourly patrols of the grounds, and ensuring that the cemetery's various buildings and mausoleums remained secure throughout the night. The cemetery's layout was particularly challenging from a security perspective due to its age and the variety of structures scattered throughout the grounds. In addition to thousands of individual graves and family plots, Greenwood contained over 200 mausoleums ranging from simple stone structures to elaborate marble temples that housed multiple generations of prominent Detroit families. Many of these mausoleums were equipped with individual security systems, but the sheer number of structures made comprehensive monitoring extremely difficult. During his first 2 months on the job, J.C. Ahn noticed several unusual patterns that initially seemed like minor security concerns, but gradually developed into something more troubling. He began to observe vehicles entering and leaving the cemetery during the overnight hours, despite the fact that the gates were locked and no authorized personnel were scheduled to be on the grounds. The vehicles appeared to be using a service entrance near the older section of the cemetery that was supposed to be accessible only to maintenance staff during daylight hours. J.C. Ahn reported these observations to cemetery management, who initially attributed the activity to maintenance contractors who might be conducting work during overnight hours to avoid disrupting funeral services. However, when J.C. Ahn requested a schedule of authorized overnight work, management was unable to provide documentation for any legitimate activities that would explain the vehicle traffic he was observing. More concerning were the subtle signs of recent human activity that J.C. Ahn began to notice around certain mausoleums during his nightly patrols. He discovered areas where the grass had been trampled by multiple people, cigarette butts, and food wrappers discarded near monuments, and most disturbing of all, evidence that someone had been tampering with the locks on several of the larger mausoleums. The lock damage was subtle and might have gone unnoticed by casual observers, but Jason's security training had taught him to look for exactly these kinds of signs. The situation became more serious in early May when J.C. Ahn discovered that one of the larger mausoleums in the cemetery's historic district had been systematically modified for unauthorized use. The Whitmore family mausoleum, built in 1892, was a substantial marble structure that contained multiple burial chambers in a small chapel area. When J.C. conducted a routine inspection of the building, he found that someone had installed additional locks on the interior doors and had brought in furniture and supplies that had no legitimate purpose in a burial facility. Inside the mausoleum, Jason discovered sleeping bags, portable camping equipment, and most disturbing of all, restraints and chains that appeared to be designed for holding human beings against their will. The chapel area had been converted into a temporary living space with basic amenities, but the atmosphere was one of confinement rather than comfort. The modifications had been made carefully to avoid damage to the historic structure, suggesting that whoever was responsible had both construction skills and a desire to avoid detection by cemetery management. Jason immediately contacted the Detroit Police Department to report his discovery, but the initial response was complicated by jurisdictional issues and uncertainty about the nature of the criminal activity. The cemetery was private property, and the modifications to the mausoleum did not clearly constitute any specific crime without evidence of how the space was being used. Police investigators documented the scene and removed the unauthorized materials, but they were unable to establish a clear connection to any ongoing criminal investigation. However, Jason's discovery had alerted the criminal organization to the fact that their activities were being monitored, and their response was swift and dangerous. 3 days after the police investigation, Jason arrived for his shift to find that his personal vehicle had been vandalized in a manner that was clearly intended as a threat. His tires had been slashed, and a note had been left on his windshield warning him to mind his own business if he wanted to continue working in the cemetery. Rather than being intimidated by the threats, Jason decided to intensify his surveillance efforts. He began conducting more frequent and less predictable patrols of the cemetery grounds, paying particular attention to areas where he had observed suspicious activity. He also started documenting his observations more carefully, creating detailed logs of vehicle descriptions, timing patterns, and any evidence of unauthorized access to cemetery buildings. Jason's enhanced surveillance efforts soon revealed the true scope of the criminal operation that was using Greenwood Cemetery as part of their infrastructure. On the night of May 18th, he observed a convoy of 3 vehicles entering the cemetery through the compromised service gate around 2 a.m. Instead of confronting the vehicles directly, Jason positioned himself where he could observe their activities while remaining hidden among the monuments and mausoleums. What Jason witnessed that night was evidence of a sophisticated human trafficking operation that was using the cemetery's mausoleums as temporary holding facilities for victims being transported through the Detroit area. The vehicles contained approximately a dozen individuals who appeared to be in various states of distress and were clearly being held against their will. The victims were moved into 3 different mausoleums that had been prepared with sleeping areas, basic sanitation facilities, and security measures to prevent escape. The operation was being conducted with military precision by individuals who clearly had experience with logistics and crowd control. The victims were processed quickly and efficiently, with each person being assigned to specific locations based on criteria that Jason could not determine from his observation point. Most disturbing of all, the operation included children and teenagers in addition to adult victims, suggesting that the trafficking network was involved in multiple types of illegal activity. Jason realized that he was witnessing something far more serious than simple cemetery vandalism or theft. The scale and organization of the operation suggested connections to major criminal networks, and the vulnerability of the victims meant that any mistake on his part could result in serious harm to innocent people. He also recognized that his own safety was now in extreme danger, as the criminals had already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and threats to protect their operation. Rather than attempting to intervene directly, Jason withdrew to a secure location and contacted federal law enforcement agencies that specialized in human trafficking investigations. His military background had taught him the importance of proper escalation procedures, when dealing with situations that exceeded his individual capabilities. He provided detailed information about what he had observed, including vehicle descriptions, timing patterns, and the specific mausoleums that were being used as holding facilities. The federal response to Jayceon's report was immediate and comprehensive. Within 24 hours, a joint task force involving the FBI, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Detroit Police Department had established surveillance around Greenwood Cemetery. The investigation revealed that the trafficking operation was part of a larger network that was moving victims through multiple cities in the Midwest, using various types of temporary facilities to avoid detection by law enforcement. The cemetery had been chosen as a holding facility because of its isolation during overnight hours, the large number of structures that could be modified for temporary use, and the assumption that law enforcement would be unlikely to suspect criminal activity in such a location. The criminals had been operating in Greenwood for over 6 months, moving an estimated 200 victims through the facility during that time period. The law enforcement operation to shut down the trafficking network required careful coordination to ensure the safety of the victims who were being held in the cemetery at the time of the raid. On the night of May 25th, federal agents simultaneously raided all 3 mausoleums that were being used as holding facilities, rescuing 15 victims and arresting 8 members of the criminal organization. Additional raids in other cities resulted in the disruption of the entire trafficking network and the rescue of dozens of additional victims. The investigation revealed that the trafficking organization had been specifically targeting vulnerable individuals, including undocumented immigrants, runaway teenagers, and homeless individuals who were unlikely to be immediately missed by family members or social service agencies. The victims were being transported to various destinations where they would be forced into labor trafficking, sexual exploitation, or other forms of modern slavery. Jayceon's role in exposing the trafficking operation earned him recognition from federal law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations, but it also made him a target for retaliation from associates of the criminal network who had not been arrested. He was forced to relocate to a different city and accept employment under an assumed identity to protect himself from potential revenge attacks. The Greenwood Cemetery case became a significant precedent for law enforcement agencies investigating human trafficking operations, demonstrating how criminal organizations exploit unexpected locations to avoid detection. The case led to enhanced security protocols at cemeteries and other facilities that offer isolation and multiple structures that could potentially be used for criminal purposes. Several of the victims rescued from Greenwood Cemetery were able to provide testimony that led to additional arrests and the dismantling of related criminal operations in other states. However, the psychological trauma experienced by individuals who were held captive among the graves and monuments of the dead created unique challenges for victim recovery services and required specialized therapeutic approaches. The mausoleums that had been used as holding facilities were extensively renovated to remove all traces of their criminal use before being returned to their intended purpose as burial sites. Cemetery management implemented enhanced security measures, including improved lighting, additional surveillance cameras, and more frequent patrols to prevent similar criminal activity in the future. The Whitmore family, whose ancestral mausoleum had been violated by the trafficking operation, established a victim assistance fund to support survivors of human trafficking and other forms of exploitation. The fund has provided resources for counseling, legal assistance, and housing support for individuals who have escaped from trafficking situations. Jayceon eventually returned to law enforcement work, specializing in investigations related to human trafficking and exploitation. His experience at Greenwood Cemetery provided him with unique insights into how criminal organizations exploit legitimate facilities and the importance of recognizing subtle signs of unauthorized activity in unexpected locations. The trafficking network that operated at Greenwood Cemetery was ultimately linked to similar operations in 12 other states, leading to over 100 arrests and the rescue of more than 300 victims. The case demonstrated the national scope of modern trafficking operations and the sophisticated methods used by criminals to exploit vulnerable individuals while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies. Our fifth chilling encounter takes us to Oak Hill Cemetery in rural Pennsylvania, where maintenance worker Jason witnessed a serial killer using fresh graves as the perfect hiding place for evidence that would never be discovered. What began as routine late-night cemetery maintenance would escalate into a deadly game of cat and mouse among the headstones that left Jason fighting for his survival. 26-year-old Jason had been working at Oak Hill Cemetery for just over a year when he stumbled upon evidence of the most disturbing criminal activity he could have imagined. The cemetery, established in 1923, served a rural community of approximately 8,000 residents and was known for its peaceful atmosphere and well-maintained grounds. Jason had taken the job after being laid off from a manufacturing plant, and he found the steady work and quiet environment to be exactly what he needed while he figured out his next career move. Oak Hill Cemetery covered 75 acres of gently rolling hills surrounded by dense forests and farmland. The isolated location meant that Jason often worked alone for hours without seeing another person, a solitude that he had grown to appreciate after years of noisy factory work. His responsibilities included grave digging, monument maintenance, landscaping, and general upkeep of the cemetery's buildings and equipment. Much of his work was scheduled during early morning or late evening hours to avoid interfering with funeral services and family visitations. Jason's first indication that something was wrong came in early October 2022, when he noticed that recently filled graves were showing signs of disturbance that could not be explained by normal settling or weather conditions. The soil over several graves that had been completed within the past month appeared to have been carefully excavated and then refilled, but not by anyone on the cemetery's maintenance staff. The work had been done skillfully enough to avoid obvious detection, but Jason's experience with proper grave preparation made the alterations obvious to his trained eye. Initially, Jason assumed that the disturbances were the result of vandalism or perhaps relatives attempting to bury personal items with their loved ones after the official burial services had been completed. However, as he examined the affected graves more carefully, he realized that the excavation work was far too extensive and professional to be the work of amateur grave robbers or grieving family members. Someone with considerable digging experience had been accessing these graves for purposes that Jason could not understand. More disturbing was the pattern of which graves had been disturbed. Rather than targeting older graves that might contain valuable jewelry or artifacts, the unknown excavator was focusing exclusively on the most recent burials. All of the affected graves belonged to individuals who'd been buried within the past 6 weeks, and all of the disturbances had occurred during overnight hours when the cemetery was closed to visitors. Jason reported his observations to cemetery management, but they initially dismissed his concerns as evidence of animal activity or natural soil shifting that was common in the clay-heavy soil of the region. However, Jason's military experience had taught him to recognize the signs of deliberate human activity, and he was certain that someone was systematically accessing recent graves for unknown purposes. The situation escalated dramatically on the night of October 23rd, when Jason decided to remain in the cemetery after his official shift ended to observe whether the mysterious excavation activity would continue. He positioned himself in the cemetery's maintenance building, where he could monitor the grounds without being detected, and settled in for what he expected might be a long and uneventful night of surveillance. Around 2 a.m., Jason observed a pickup truck entering the cemetery through a service gate that should have been locked. The vehicle's headlights were turned off, and the driver was clearly attempting to avoid detection by anyone who might be in the area. The truck proceeded directly to the grave of Margaret Hendricks, a 67-year-old woman who had been buried just 5 days earlier following a private family service. What Jason witnessed next was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The driver of the truck, a tall man wearing work clothes and carrying professional excavation tools, began systematically digging down to Margaret Hendricks' casket. However, instead of attempting to rob the grave or disturb the deceased, the man opened a large duffel bag and began placing items inside the casket alongside the body. From his observation point, Jason could not clearly see what was being buried with Mrs. Hendricks, but the items appeared to include clothing, plastic bags containing unidentifiable materials, and what looked like personal belongings that clearly had not belonged to the deceased. The man worked quickly and efficiently, suggesting extensive experience with this type of activity, and he took careful steps to restore the grave to its original appearance when his work was completed. As Jason watched in horror, he realized that he was witnessing a serial killer using recent burials as disposal sites for evidence from his crimes. The killer had developed a method that was virtually foolproof, because no law enforcement agency would ever think to exhume recent graves to search for evidence, and the items would remain hidden permanently alongside the legitimate remains. Jason faced an impossible decision about how to respond to what he was witnessing. His instinct was to immediately contact law enforcement, but he realized that he had no way to prove what he had observed, and his testimony alone would never be sufficient to convince authorities to exhume a recently buried body. More importantly, he was now a witness to criminal activity that could make him a target for elimination by someone who had clearly killed multiple people. Instead of confronting the situation directly, Jason decided to gather more evidence that could support his eventual report to police. He began photographing the disturbed graves with his cell phone, documenting the subtle signs of excavation that he had learned to recognize. He also started maintaining detailed written logs of his observations, including dates, times, and descriptions of any unusual activity he noticed around recent burial sites. Over the following 2 weeks, Jason observed the killer returning to the cemetery 3 more times, always targeting graves that were less than 2 weeks old, and always working with the same methodical precision that had characterized his first observed visit. The killer appeared to be disposing of evidence from multiple crimes, suggesting an active serial murder campaign that had been ongoing for months or possibly years. Jason's surveillance efforts revealed disturbing details about the killer's methods and victim selection. The evidence being disposed of included women's clothing and jewelry that appeared to belong to different individuals, suggesting that the killer was targeting multiple victims rather than focusing on a single type. Most horrifying of all, some of the items being buried appeared to include body parts that had been removed from victims, indicating a level of brutality and sadism that went far beyond simple murder. The killer's familiarity with cemetery operations and grave excavation techniques suggested that he might be connected to the funeral industry, or might have previous experience working in cemeteries. His knowledge of which graves would be safe to disturb and his ability to restore them to their original appearance indicated expertise that would be difficult for an outsider to acquire. This realization made Jason suspect that the killer might be someone from the local community who had legitimate reasons to be familiar with cemetery procedures. On the night of November 8th, Jason's surveillance operation took a deadly turn when the killer discovered that he was being watched. Jason had positioned himself in a different location to get better photographs of the evidence disposal process, but his movement had apparently been detected by the killer, who was clearly more observant and cautious than Jason had realized. Instead of fleeing when he realized he was being observed, the killer began stalking Jason through the cemetery grounds. What followed was a terrifying game of cat and mouse among the headstones and monuments, with Jason using his knowledge of the cemetery's layout to stay ahead of a murderer who was clearly determined to eliminate the only witness to his crimes. The chase continued for over 2 hours, with the killer demonstrating tactical skills that suggested military or law enforcement training. He moved silently through the cemetery, using the monuments and mausoleums as cover while systematically cutting off Jason's escape routes. Most terrifying of all, the killer seemed to be enjoying the hunt, occasionally calling out to Jason in a calm conversational tone that made the situation even more disturbing. Jason's survival depended on his intimate knowledge of the cemetery's terrain and his ability to remain hidden among the graves and monuments. He used every piece of cover available, moving from headstone to mausoleum while trying to work his way toward the cemetery entrance where he might be able to reach his vehicle and escape. However, the killer had anticipated this strategy and had positioned himself to intercept any attempt to reach the parking area. The confrontation finally came to a head when Jason found himself cornered in the cemetery's oldest section, surrounded by monuments that dated back to the 1920s. The killer approached his hiding place with confidence, clearly believing that he had successfully trapped his prey. However, Jason had discovered that one of the older mausoleums had a rear entrance that was concealed by overgrown vegetation, providing him with an unexpected escape route. As the killer closed in on what he thought was Jason's location, Jason emerged from the hidden entrance behind him and struck him with a piece of broken monument that he had picked up during his retreat. The blow was sufficient to disable the killer temporarily, giving Jason the opportunity to reach his vehicle and escape from the cemetery. Jason drove directly to the local police station, where his report of the incident initially met with skepticism from officers who found his account difficult to believe. However, when police returned to the cemetery to investigate, they found the killer's truck still parked near Margaret Hendricks's grave, along with excavation tools and a partially filled duffel bag containing evidence from multiple crime scenes. The killer, identified as Robert Morrison, was a 43-year-old former funeral home employee who had been using his knowledge of cemetery operations to dispose of evidence from a murder spree that had lasted over 3 years. Morrison had killed 12 women in 3 different states, carefully selecting victims who were unlikely to be immediately missed and disposing of evidence in fresh graves that would never be searched by law enforcement. Morrison's arrest led to the recovery of evidence from multiple crime scenes and the identification of several previously unknown victims. The investigation revealed that he had been operating across state lines, using his knowledge of funeral industry practices to identify suitable disposal sites in multiple cemeteries throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The graves that Morrison had used for evidence disposal were carefully exhumed under court order, revealing a horrifying collection of evidence that linked him to crimes spanning several years. The recovered evidence included personal belongings from victims, weapons used in the murders, and body parts that Morrison had kept as trophies from his crimes. Jason's testimony was crucial in securing Morrison's conviction on multiple counts of murder, and his courage in gathering evidence despite the personal danger earned him recognition from law enforcement agencies throughout the region. However, the psychological trauma of his experience led him to leave cemetery work and relocate to a different state where he could rebuild his life away from the memories of those terrifying nights among the graves. Morrison was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for his crimes. The case led to enhanced security measures at cemeteries throughout the region and new protocols for monitoring recent burial sites to prevent similar criminal activity in the future. Our 6th horrifying encounter takes us to Sunset Memorial Gardens in Oregon, where 29-year-old Sam discovered that her missing sister's belongings in a groundskeeper's maintenance shed were just the beginning of a decades-long pattern of violence that had been hidden beneath the peaceful surface of the cemetery. What started as a desperate search for answers would expose a trusted employee's dark secret that had claimed multiple victims over the years. Sam had been searching for her younger sister Jessica for 8 months when a tip from a homeless man led her to Sunset Memorial Gardens on the outskirts of Portland. Jessica, a 23-year-old struggling with addiction, had disappeared in February 2023 while staying at a transitional housing facility downtown. Despite extensive searches by both police and family members, no trace of Jessica had been found until the homeless man claimed to have seen her talking to a cemetery worker in the days before her disappearance. Sunset Memorial Gardens had served the Portland metropolitan area since 1952, covering 150 acres of carefully maintained grounds that provided burial services for families from diverse cultural and economic backgrounds. The cemetery was known for its professional staff and well-maintained facilities, with a reputation for treating all families with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances. Sam had never had reason to visit the cemetery before beginning her search for Jessica, but she was determined to follow every possible lead. Sam's initial inquiries at the cemetery's administrative office were met with polite but unhelpful responses from staff members who claimed no knowledge of her sister or any unusual incidents involving transient individuals. However, Sam's persistence and her background as a social worker had taught her to recognize when people were being evasive, and she sensed that the administrative staff was not telling her everything they knew about potential interactions between cemetery employees and vulnerable individuals from the surrounding community. Rather than give up on her investigation, Sam decided to conduct her own surveillance of the cemetery to see if she could identify the employee who had allegedly spoken with Jessica. She began visiting the grounds during different times of day and on different days of the week, observing the various workers and trying to determine which staff members might have had opportunities to interact with people from outside the cemetery community. During her surveillance, Sam noticed that one particular groundskeeper seemed to work unusual hours and often remained on the cemetery grounds long after other employees had left for the day. The man, who appeared to be in his 50s, drove an older pickup truck and seemed to have access to areas of the cemetery that other workers did not visit regularly. More importantly, Sam observed him engaging in conversations with several individuals who appeared to be homeless or transient, interactions that seemed inconsistent with normal cemetery operations. Sam's breakthrough came when she decided to approach the groundskeeper directly to ask about Jessica. She waited until he was working alone in a remote section of the cemetery and introduced herself as someone looking for information about her missing sister. The man, who identified himself as Dale, initially claimed no knowledge of Jessica or any interactions with people matching her description. However, Sam noticed that Dale seemed nervous during their conversation and kept glancing toward a maintenance shed that was located in an isolated area of the cemetery grounds. His body language suggested that he was hiding something significant, and Sam's social work training had taught her to recognize the signs of deception in people who were attempting to conceal information about vulnerable individuals. After Dale left the area, Sam decided to investigate the maintenance shed that had seemed to make him so uncomfortable. The building was located in a section of the cemetery that was rarely visited by the public, surrounded by older graves and screened from view by mature trees. When Sam approached the shed, she discovered that it was secured with multiple locks that seemed excessive for a building that supposedly contained only landscaping equipment and maintenance supplies. Sam waited until late evening and returned to the cemetery when she was unlikely to encounter other staff members or visitors. Using tools she had borrowed from a friend, she was able to open the locks on the maintenance shed and investigate its contents. What she discovered inside was evidence that her worst fears about Jessica's fate were tragically accurate. The shed contained personal belongings from multiple different women, including jewelry, identification cards, clothing, and other items that clearly did not belong to a cemetery groundskeeper. Among these possessions, Sam recognized several items that had belonged to Jessica, including a distinctive necklace that their grandmother had given her and a wallet that Sam had helped Jessica purchase shortly before her disappearance. More disturbing than the personal belongings were the photographs that Sam found hidden in a toolbox inside the shed. The images showed multiple women in various states of distress, clearly taken without their consent and in circumstances that suggested they were being held against their will. Some of the photographs showed women who appeared to be unconscious or deceased, indicating that Dale's activities went far beyond simple theft or harassment. Sam also discovered detailed written records that Dale had been keeping about his interactions with vulnerable women over a period that appeared to span more than 15 years. The records included names, dates, locations where he had encountered victims, and disturbing descriptions of what he had done to them. The documentation suggested that Dale had been systematically targeting homeless women, sex workers, and individuals struggling with addiction, people who were unlikely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. Among the records, Sam found references to burial locations throughout Sunset Memorial Gardens, where Dale had disposed of his victims. The entries indicated that he had been using his position as groundskeeper to bury bodies in areas of the cemetery that were not actively monitored, sometimes placing victims in graves that had been prepared for legitimate burials that were scheduled for later dates. Realizing that she had discovered evidence of multiple murders spanning more than a decade, Sam immediately contacted the Portland Police Department to report her findings. However, her initial report was complicated by the fact that she had obtained the evidence through illegal entry into Dale's shed, potentially compromising the admissibility of the materials in any criminal prosecution. The police investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Dale's criminal activities and the systematic way he had exploited his position at the cemetery to prey on vulnerable women. Dale Morrison had been employed at Sunset Memorial Gardens for 18 years, during which time he had used his access to cemetery grounds and his knowledge of burial procedures to conceal evidence of at least 23 murders. Dale's method involved approaching vulnerable women in downtown Portland and surrounding areas, offering them temporary work or assistance that would bring them to the cemetery grounds. Once isolated, he would assault and murder his victims, then use his knowledge of the cemetery's operations to dispose of their bodies in locations where they would never be discovered during normal cemetery activities. The investigation revealed that Dale had been particularly careful to target women whose disappearances would not trigger intensive police investigations. He focused on individuals who were estranged from their families, struggling with substance abuse, or involved in sex work, calculating that their deaths would be attributed to the dangers of their lifestyles rather than foul play. Dale's burial methods were sophisticated and took advantage of his detailed knowledge of cemetery operations. He would inter victims in graves that had been pre-dug for future legitimate burials, temporarily placing bodies in locations where they would be covered by sanctioned burials within days or weeks. He also used areas of the cemetery that were designated for future expansion, knowing that these locations would not be disturbed for years or decades. The excavation of Dale's disposal sites required extensive coordination between law enforcement agencies, the medical examiner's office, and cemetery management. Ground-penetrating radar was used to identify potential burial locations without unnecessarily disturbing legitimate graves, and archaeological techniques were employed to recover evidence while maintaining respect for the families whose loved ones were legitimately buried in the cemetery. The recovery operation ultimately located the remains of 19 victims, including Jessica, whose body was found in an area of the cemetery that had been designated for future columbarium development. The condition of the remains provided evidence of the brutal methods Dale had used to kill his victims, and personal belongings found with the bodies helped investigators identify individuals who had been missing for years. Dale was arrested at his home and initially attempted to claim that the evidence found in his shed had been planted by someone attempting to frame him. However, DNA evidence linked him to multiple crime scenes, and the detailed records he had kept provided prosecutors with compelling evidence of his systematic criminal activity over nearly 2 decades. The case against Dale was strengthened by testimony from several women who had survived encounters with him, individuals who had accepted his offers of work or assistance but had managed to escape before becoming victims. These survivors provided crucial information about Dale's methods and helped establish a pattern of predatory behavior that supported the physical evidence found at the cemetery. During the investigation, police discovered that Dale had been operating with virtual impunity for years because of assumptions about the victims he chose and the locations where he disposed of evidence. The combination of his legitimate access to cemetery grounds and his careful selection of vulnerable victims had allowed him to avoid detection despite the extensive nature of his criminal activities. Dale ultimately pleaded guilty to 19 counts of murder in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His plea agreement included cooperation with ongoing efforts to identify additional victims and locate any remaining disposal sites that had not yet been discovered. The case led to significant changes in hiring and supervision practices at cemeteries throughout the Pacific Northwest, including enhanced background checks for employees with access to burial sites, and improved monitoring of after-hours activities on cemetery grounds. Sunset Memorial Gardens implemented new security measures and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar criminal activity in the future. Sam's determination to find her sister not only brought closure to Jessica's case, but also provided justice for 18 other families who had been searching for answers about their missing loved ones. Her courage in pursuing the investigation, despite personal danger, earned recognition from victim advocacy organizations and law enforcement agencies throughout Oregon. The discovery of Dale's crimes also led to renewed attention to the issue of violence against vulnerable women and the need for better protection and support services for individuals who are at risk of the exploitation. Several organizations use the case to advocate for improved resources for homeless women and individuals struggling with addiction. Jessica and the other victims were given proper burials in a section of Sunset Memorial Gardens that was dedicated to their memory, with individual headstones provided by donations from community members who were moved by the tragedy of their deaths and the circumstances that had made them vulnerable to Dale's predations. Our 7th terrifying encounter takes us to Restwood Cemetery in rural Georgia, where 32-year-old Khaleesi's late-night visit to her mother's grave triggered violent poltergeist activity that followed her home and grew stronger with each passing night. What began as a daughter's need to find comfort at her mother's resting place would unleash supernatural forces that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. Khaleesi had been struggling with grief for 6 months following the sudden death of her mother, Elena, from a heart attack in March 2023. Elena had been only 54 years old and had shown no previous signs of heart problems, making her unexpected death particularly difficult for Khaleesi to accept. As an only child whose father had died when she was 12, Khaleesi felt completely alone in the world after losing her mother, the person who had been her closest confidant and strongest source of support throughout her life. Restwood Cemetery, established in 1889, served the small farming community of Millbrook, Georgia, where 4 generations of Khaleesi's family had been buried. The cemetery covered 40 acres of gently rolling hills surrounded by cotton fields and pine forests, creating a peaceful atmosphere that had always provided comfort to local families during times of loss. Elena's grave was located in the newer section of the cemetery, marked by a simple granite headstone that Khaleesi had chosen to reflect her mother's preference for understated elegance. During the months following Elena's burial, Khaleesi had visited the grave regularly during daylight hours, finding that spending time at the site helped her process her grief and feel connected to her mother's memory. However, her work schedule as a night shift nurse at the regional hospital had recently changed, making it difficult for her to visit during normal cemetery hours. The emotional stress of her demanding job, combined with her unresolved grief, had been taking a serious toll on her mental and physical health. On the night of September 15th, 2023, Khaleesi decided to visit her mother's grave after completing her shift at the hospital. It was nearly midnight when she arrived at Restwood Cemetery, but she felt a desperate need to spend time at Elena's resting place and talk through the overwhelming emotions that had been building up inside her. The cemetery gates were locked, but Khaleesi knew of a section of fencing that had been damaged by a recent storm, allowing her to enter the grounds without having to wait until the following day. The cemetery at midnight was completely different from the peaceful place Khaleesi remembered from her daytime visits. The usual sounds of rural life had been replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to amplify every footstep as she walked along the gravel paths toward her mother's grave. The only illumination came from a partial moon that cast long shadows between the headstones, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. When Khaleesi reached Elena's grave, she knelt beside the headstone and began speaking to her mother, as she had done during previous visits. She talked about her struggles at work, her loneliness, and her difficulty accepting that Elena was truly gone. As she spoke, Khaleesi felt a sense of peace and connection that she had been desperately seeking, and for the first time in weeks, she felt that she might be able to begin healing from her loss. However, as Khaleesi continued her conversation with her deceased mother, she began to notice subtle changes in the environment around her. The temperature seemed to be dropping rapidly, despite the warm September night, and her breath was beginning to form visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. More disturbing was the sensation that someone was listening to her conversation, though she could see no other person anywhere in the cemetery. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as Khaleesi remained at the gravesite, and she began to hear sounds that seemed to be responses to her words. At first, the sounds were so faint that she thought they might be wind moving through the nearby trees, but gradually they resolved into what sounded like whispered words in her mother's voice. The whispers were barely audible and seemed to be coming from the ground beneath Elena's headstone. Khaleesi initially felt comforted by what she interpreted as a sign that her mother's spirit was still present and aware of her visits. She continued talking to the grave, asking questions about her future and seeking guidance about how to move forward with her life. The whispered responses seemed to provide the reassurance and advice that Khaleesi had been desperately seeking, and she felt more emotionally stable than she had since Elena's death. However, as the night progressed, the whispered voices began to change in ways that made Khaleesi increasingly uncomfortable. What had initially sounded like her mother's gentle and loving voice began to take on a harsh and demanding tone. The whispers started making requests that seemed inappropriate and disturbing, asking Khaleesi to bring offerings to the grave and to visit more frequently regardless of the inconvenience to her work and personal life. More alarming was the way the whispered voices seemed to know intimate details about Khaleesi's life that her mother had never known, including information about recent events that had occurred after Elena's death. The voices began making references to Khaleesi's co-workers, her financial situation, and her romantic relationships with a level of detail that suggested supernatural surveillance rather than motherly concern. As dawn approached, Khaleesi decided to end her visit and return home, but she found that the supernatural activity that had begun at her mother's grave was not confined to the cemetery grounds. During her drive home, she experienced electrical problems with her car that had never occurred before, including flickering lights, radio static, and brief engine failures that seemed to correspond with her emotional state, rather than any mechanical issues. When Khaleesi arrived at her apartment, she discovered that the poltergeist activity that had begun at the cemetery was continuing and intensifying in her living space. Lights flickered throughout her home, doors opened and closed without explanation, and objects moved from their normal locations to places where Khaleesi was certain she had not left them. Most disturbing of all, the whispered voices that had spoken to her at the cemetery continued to communicate with her, now coming from various locations throughout her apartment. Over the following nights, the supernatural activity in Khaleesi's home escalated dramatically. The poltergeist phenomena became more aggressive and destructive, with dishes breaking spontaneously, furniture moving across rooms, and electronic devices malfunctioning in ways that suggested intelligent manipulation rather than random electrical problems. The whispered voices became louder and more insistent, making demands that became increasingly inappropriate and threatening. Khaleesi began to realize that whatever had been awakened during her midnight visit to her mother's grave was not the benevolent spirit of Elena, but something else entirely that was using her grief and emotional vulnerability to establish a connection with the living world. The entity seemed to feed on her emotions, becoming stronger and more active when she was upset or distressed, and growing more aggressive when she attempted to ignore its presence or establish boundaries. The situation became dangerous when the entity began to manifest physical effects that could cause real harm to Khaleesi and others. Objects were thrown with considerable force, creating hazards that could result in serious injuries. The electrical disturbances became severe enough to create fire hazards, and the temperature fluctuations in her apartment became extreme enough to damage plumbing and affect her health. Most terrifying was the entity's apparent ability to influence Khaleesi's behavior and decision-making processes. She found herself compelled to return to her mother's grave at inappropriate times, often in the middle of the night or during severe weather conditions. The entity seemed to be trying to draw her back to the cemetery for purposes that Khaleesi did not understand, but instinctively recognized as dangerous. Desperate for help, Khaleesi contacted several local religious organizations, but most were reluctant to become involved in what they viewed as either a psychological problem or a situation beyond their expertise. However, a priest from a nearby Catholic church agreed to visit her apartment and assess the situation. Father Martinez had experience dealing with unusual spiritual phenomena and was able to confirm that Khaleesi was indeed dealing with genuine supernatural activity. Father Martinez explained that Khaleesi had likely encountered a malevolent entity that was using her grief and her mother's grave as a focal point for establishing a connection with the living world. The entity was not Elena's spirit, but rather something that had been attracted to the cemetery by the emotional energy generated by grieving visitors over many decades. Such entities were known to be particularly drawn to individuals who were emotionally vulnerable and who visited burial sites during times when spiritual barriers were weakest. The exorcism process that followed was complex and required multiple sessions over several weeks. Father Martinez explained that the entity had established a strong connection with Khaleesi through her initial contact at the cemetery, and breaking that connection required both spiritual intervention and psychological healing to address the grief and vulnerability that had made her susceptible to supernatural influence. During the exorcism sessions, the entity demonstrated considerable resistance to being banished, manifesting increasingly violent phenomena and making threats against both Khaleesi and Father Martinez. The process revealed that the entity had been active in Restwood Cemetery for many years, preying on grieving visitors and using their emotional pain to strengthen its connection to the physical world. The final exorcism session required the assistance of additional clergy and took place simultaneously at both Khaleesi's apartment and her mother's gravesite. The ritual involved blessing both locations and establishing spiritual barriers that would prevent the entity from re-establishing contact with Khaleesi or using Elena's grave as a focal point for future manifestations. Following the successful completion of the exorcism, Khaleesi experienced immediate relief from the poltergeist activity that had been plaguing her for weeks. However, the psychological effects of her supernatural encounter required ongoing counseling to address both her original grief and the additional trauma caused by the entity's manipulation and threats. Khaleesi eventually relocated to a different city to establish distance from the cemetery and the memories associated with her supernatural encounter. She continued to honor her mother's memory through private rituals and charitable activities that Elena would have supported, but she never again visited Restwood Cemetery or any other burial ground during nighttime hours. Father Martinez worked with cemetery management to establish protocols for addressing similar supernatural incidents in the future, including enhanced security measures to prevent unauthorized nighttime access and resources for families who might experience unusual phenomena related to their visits to loved ones' graves. The case became a subject of study for paranormal researchers and religious scholars interested in understanding how grief and emotional vulnerability can create conditions that allow malevolent entities to establish connections with living individuals. Several academic papers were published about the incident, contributing to improved understanding of supernatural phenomena related to burial sites and grief counseling. Restwood Cemetery implemented new policies regarding after-hours access and established partnerships with local religious organizations to provide support for families who might experience spiritual difficulties related to their grief. The cemetery also installed improved lighting and security systems to discourage unauthorized visits that might create conditions favorable to supernatural activity. Our eighth disturbing encounter takes us to Elmwood Cemetery in Massachusetts, where 24-year-old college student Jakai became possessed by multiple spirits during an unauthorized seance, speaking in the voices of people who had died violently and revealing secrets that the dead were never meant to share. What began as a paranormal investigation assignment would transform into a horrifying supernatural experience that left Jakai forever changed by his contact with the restless dead. Jakai was a senior at Salem State University, majoring in psychology with a focus on parapsychology, when he decided to conduct an independent research project on electronic voice phenomena and spirit communication. His academic advisor had approved a study examining whether modern recording equipment could capture evidence of supernatural communication in locations with reported paranormal activity. Elmwood Cemetery, established in 1851, had a reputation among local paranormal enthusiasts as one of the most active supernatural sites in New England. The cemetery covered 200 acres of rolling hills dotted with elaborate Victorian monuments and ancient oak trees that created an atmosphere of timeless mystery. Elmwood was the final resting place for many prominent Massachusetts families, including several individuals who had died under mysterious or violent circumstances during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Local folklore claimed that the spirits of these restless dead continued to wander the cemetery grounds, seeking resolution for the injustices they had suffered in life. Jakai had chosen Elmwood specifically because of its documented history of paranormal encounters and its connection to several unsolved historical mysteries. His research had identified at least 12 individuals buried in the cemetery who had died under suspicious circumstances, including victims of murder, suicide, and unexplained accidents. His hypothesis was that the emotional trauma associated with violent death might create conditions that would make spirit communication more likely to occur. For his research project, Jakai had assembled sophisticated recording equipment, including digital audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, and infrared cameras that could document any unusual phenomena that might occur during his investigation. He had also studied historical seance techniques from the spiritualist movement of the late 1800s, believing that combining traditional methods with modern technology might produce more reliable results than previous paranormal investigations. On the night of October 31st, 2022, Jakai entered Elmwood Cemetery with permission from the administration, who had agreed to allow his research as part of a legitimate academic study. He had chosen Halloween night because historical accounts suggested that supernatural activity was often heightened during times when the boundary between the living and dead was considered to be at its thinnest. His plan was to conduct recording sessions at several specific grave sites and then analyze the audio for evidence of electronic voice phenomena. Jakai began his investigation at the grave of Margaret Ashworth, a 23-year-old woman who had been murdered by her husband in 1887 in a case that had scandalized local society. According to historical records, Margaret had been attempting to leave her abusive marriage when her husband discovered her plans and killed her in a fit of rage. The husband had been convicted and executed, but local legend claimed that Margaret's spirit remained in the cemetery, seeking acknowledgement of the injustice she had suffered. Using a combination of traditional seance techniques and modern recording equipment, Jakai attempted to establish communication with Margaret's spirit. He spoke aloud to the grave, asking respectful questions about her life and death, while his equipment recorded any potential responses. For the first hour, his efforts produced no unusual results beyond normal environmental sounds and electromagnetic readings consistent with the cemetery's electrical infrastructure. However, as Jakai continued his investigation, he began to experience subtle changes in his environment that suggested supernatural presence. The temperature around Margaret's grave dropped significantly, despite the mild October weather, and his electromagnetic field detectors began registering fluctuations that did not correspond to any identifiable electrical sources. More importantly, Jakai began to feel a growing sense of unease that seemed to originate from sources beyond his own nervousness about conducting the investigation. Around midnight, Jakai's recording equipment began capturing voices that were clearly not his own, faint whispers that seemed to be responding to his questions about Margaret's death. The voices were barely audible but appeared to be providing information about the circumstances of her murder that had not been included in the historical records he had studied. As the communication became clearer, Jakai realized that he was receiving details about the case that could only have been known by someone who had witnessed the crime. Encouraged by this apparent success, Jakai decided to expand his investigation to include other graves of individuals who had died violently. He moved to the burial site of Thomas Blackwood, a businessman who had been killed in 1903 under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Local newspapers from the time had reported that Thomas had been found dead in his locked office with no signs of forced entry, leading to speculation about suicide, murder, or supernatural intervention. As Jakai began attempting communication with Thomas's spirit, the supernatural activity that had been subtle at Margaret's grave became dramatically more intense. His recording equipment began malfunctioning in ways that suggested intentional interference rather than random technical problems. The electromagnetic readings became erratic, and the temperature fluctuations became severe enough to cause condensation to form on his equipment despite the dry autumn air. Most disturbing was the way that Jakai himself began to change during the attempted communication with Thomas's spirit. He found himself speaking in a voice that was not his own, using vocabulary and speech patterns that were characteristic of early 20th century business language. The voice that emerged from his throat provided detailed information about Thomas's business dealings and the circumstances that had led to his death, information that Jakai had never encountered in his historical research. As the night progressed, Jakai's attempts at spirit communication spiraled completely out of his control. Additional voices began speaking through him, each representing a different individual who had been buried in Elmwood Cemetery after dying under violent or mysterious circumstances. The spirits seemed to be competing for the opportunity to communicate through Jakai, resulting in overlapping conversations that became increasingly chaotic and disturbing. The possessed state that Jakai experienced was unlike anything described in academic literature about seances or spirit communication. Rather than maintaining conscious control over the process, he found himself becoming a passive conduit for multiple entities who were using his vocal cords and physical body to communicate with the living world. The spirits spoke in languages he did not understand, referenced historical events he had never studied, and provided information about crimes and injustices that had been covered up or forgotten. Most terrifying was the realization that the spirits communicating through Jakai were not seeking peaceful resolution or spiritual closure. Instead, they were angry, vengeful entities who wanted to use their connection with the living world to expose secrets and seek retribution against people who had wronged them during their lifetimes. The information they provided was often disturbing and potentially dangerous, involving accusations of murder, fraud, and other serious crimes committed by prominent historical figures. As dawn approached, Jakai found that he was unable to end the seance or regain control over his own voice and actions. The spirits that had taken possession of him seemed reluctant to return to whatever realm they normally inhabited, and they began making demands that he continue to serve as their spokesperson in the living world. They wanted him to contact descendants of their enemies, reveal hidden evidence of historical crimes, and take actions that would provide them with the revenge they had been seeking for decades or centuries. The possession experience finally ended when Jakai's roommate, concerned about his failure to return from the cemetery investigation, contacted campus security to conduct a welfare check. Security officers found Jakai collapsed near Thomas Blackwood's grave, apparently unconscious and suffering from exposure to the cold temperatures that had persisted throughout the night. His recording equipment had been scattered around the burial site, and much of it showed evidence of damage that could not be explained by normal environmental factors. When Jakai regained consciousness, he had no memory of the final hours of his investigation or the possession experience that had occurred. However, his recording equipment had captured hours of audio featuring multiple voices speaking through him, providing detailed information about historical crimes and supernatural phenomena that he could not have known through normal research methods. The audio recordings became the subject of extensive analysis by both academic researchers and paranormal investigators. Medical examinations following Jakai's recovery showed no evidence of drug use or mental illness that could explain his experience, but psychological evaluation revealed significant trauma consistent with having experienced severe dissociative episodes. More concerning were the lasting effects of his contact with the vengeful spirits, including recurring nightmares, episodes of speaking in voices that were not his own, and an ongoing sense of being watched or followed by unseen entities. The academic analysis of Jakai's recordings revealed information about historical crimes and mysteries that had never been publicly documented, suggesting that he had indeed made contact with individuals who possessed knowledge that could only have been acquired through direct experience of past events. However, attempts to verify the historical claims made by the spirits proved difficult due to the passage of time and the destruction of many relevant records. Jakai's experience led to significant changes in the university's policies regarding student research into paranormal phenomena, including requirements for faculty supervision and safety protocols for investigations conducted in potentially dangerous locations. The psychology department established new guidelines for research involving altered states of consciousness and supernatural beliefs, recognizing the potential for psychological harm from such investigations. Following his recovery, Jakai abandoned his academic focus on parapsychology and transferred to a different program that did not involve supernatural research. However, he continued to experience periodic episodes of involuntary spirit communication, suggesting that his contact with the cemetery spirits had created a permanent connection that could not be easily severed. These ongoing experiences required long-term therapeutic intervention and support from specialists in supernatural trauma. The Elmwood Cemetery Administration implemented new restrictions on after-hours access following Jakai's incident, recognizing that unsupervised paranormal investigations could pose serious risks to both investigators and the spiritual balance of the cemetery grounds. They also established partnerships with local religious organizations to provide spiritual cleansing services for individuals who might experience supernatural difficulties related to cemetery visits. Paranormal researchers who studied Jakai's case noted similarities to historical accounts of mediumship and spirit possession, but emphasized the unusual intensity and duration of his experience compared to typical seance phenomena. The case became a subject of ongoing research into the psychological and spiritual risks associated with attempting to communicate with spirits who had died under traumatic circumstances. The spirits that communicated through Jakai provided information that led to renewed interest in several unsolved historical mysteries, including the circumstances surrounding Thomas Blackwood's death and other cases involving prominent Massachusetts families. However, the vengeful nature of these communications raised ethical questions about whether such information should be pursued or publicized, given the potential for harm to living descendants. Local spiritual practitioners who became aware of Jakai's case worked to establish protective barriers around Elmwood Cemetery to prevent similar incidents in the future. Recognizing that the concentration of traumatic deaths in the location had created conditions that were particularly favorable to dangerous supernatural encounters. These protective measures included both traditional religious blessings and indigenous cleansing rituals designed to help restless spirits find peace. The long-term effects of Jakai's possession experience continued to manifest years after the initial incident, including ongoing sensitivity to supernatural phenomena and periodic episodes of involuntary mediumship that required careful management to prevent further spiritual trauma. His case became an important example of the potential dangers associated with uncontrolled contact with vengeful spirits and the need for proper protective measures when conducting paranormal research. Our ninth terrifying encounter takes us to Hillcrest Cemetery in rural Tennessee, where 31-year-old history enthusiast Braylon's metal detecting hobby in an old cemetery awakened something ancient that began systematically hunting anyone who disturbed the graves. What started as an innocent search for historical artifacts would unleash a malevolent entity that had been guarding the burial ground for over a century. Braylon had been metal detecting for nearly 8 years when he received permission from the Hillcrest Cemetery Board to search for historical artifacts in the older sections of the burial ground. As a member of the Tennessee Historical Society and an amateur archaeologist, Braylon had built a reputation for conducting respectful and scientifically valuable searches that had contributed to several local museum collections. His specialty was locating Civil War-era artifacts and personal items that could provide insight into the lives of ordinary people during the 19th century. Hillcrest Cemetery, established in 1847, covered 120 acres of rolling hills in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The cemetery contained graves dating back to the earliest European settlement of the region, including the burial sites of Cherokee families who had been forcibly relocated during the Trail of Tears. The older sections of the cemetery were particularly interesting to historians because they contained the remains of individuals who had lived through some of the most turbulent periods in Tennessee history. Braylon's interest in Hillcrest had been sparked by historical records indicating that the cemetery grounds had been used as a temporary burial site for casualties from several Civil War skirmishes that had occurred in the area. Military historians believed that some of these battlefield burials had never been properly documented, and there was speculation that personal effects from soldiers and civilians might still be buried in unmarked locations throughout the grounds. Cemetery management had agreed to allow Braylon's metal detecting activities, with the understanding that he would follow strict protocols for documenting any discoveries and would ensure that all finds were properly preserved and studied. His work would be supervised by a local archaeologist, and any human remains encountered would be treated with appropriate respect and reburied according to historical preservation guidelines. On a crisp October morning in 2022, Braylon began his systematic search of the cemetery's oldest section, an area that contained graves dating back to the 1850s and had been identified by ground-penetrating radar as potentially containing unmarked burial sites. His metal detector was a high-end model capable of discriminating between different types of metals and providing detailed information about the size and depth of buried objects. During his first few hours of searching, Braylon discovered several items that were consistent with typical cemetery finds from the 19th century. These included corroded metal buttons from period clothing, fragments of casket hardware, and various personal items that had been buried with deceased individuals according to the customs of the time. Each discovery was carefully documented with GPS coordinates and photographs before being removed for further study. However, as Braylon worked his way deeper into the oldest section of the cemetery, his metal detector began registering signals that were unlike anything he had encountered in his years of experience. The device indicated the presence of large metallic objects buried at considerable depths, far below the level where typical grave goods would be expected. More puzzling was the fact that these signals seemed to move slightly between detection attempts, as if the buried objects were somehow shifting position underground. The first unusual discovery came when Braylon's detector registered a strong signal near a cluster of unmarked graves that appeared to date from the 1840s. When he began carefully excavating the site, following proper archaeological procedures, he uncovered what appeared to be an ornate metal container buried approximately 4 feet below the surface. The container was unlike any burial artifact he had previously encountered, featuring intricate engravings that did not match known Cherokee, European, or African American burial traditions from the period. The metal container was roughly the size of a small coffin, but was clearly not designed for human burial. The engravings that covered its surface included symbols that appeared to combine elements from multiple different cultural traditions, suggesting that it had been created by someone with knowledge of diverse spiritual practices. More disturbing were the warning symbols that were clearly visible among the decorative elements, images that seemed designed to discourage anyone from opening or disturbing the container. As Braylon documented his discovery and prepared to notify the supervising archaeologist, he began to experience subtle changes in his environment that suggested his excavation had triggered something more than archaeological interest. The temperature in the immediate area around his dig site dropped noticeably, despite the warm October weather, and birds and small animals that had been active throughout the morning suddenly disappeared from the vicinity. More concerning was the reaction of his metal detector, which began producing erratic readings that did not correspond to any buried objects. The device seemed to be detecting metallic signatures that moved rapidly through the ground in patterns that defied explanation. The electromagnetic interference became so severe that Braylon was forced to shut down his equipment and continue his documentation, using only visual observation and manual measurement techniques. When the supervising archaeologist arrived to examine Braylon's discovery, she immediately recognized that the metal container represented something far more significant than typical burial goods. Dr. Sarah Whitfield, who specialized in indigenous burial practices and frontier-era archaeology, identified the engravings as incorporating elements from both Cherokee spiritual traditions and European folk magic practices that had been brought to the region by early settlers. Dr. Whitfield explained that the combination of symbols suggested that the container had been buried as part of a binding ritual designed to contain something that was considered dangerous to the living community. The warning symbols were consistent with protective practices used by various cultural groups to mark locations that should not be disturbed, and the depth of the burial suggested that whoever had interred the container had wanted to ensure that it would never be accidentally discovered. Despite Dr. Whitfield's concerns about the nature of the discovery, professional curiosity and archaeological protocol required that the container be properly examined and documented. However, as preparations began for carefully opening the artifact under controlled conditions, both Braylon and Dr. Whitfield began to experience phenomena that suggested their investigation had already gone too far. The first sign of supernatural activity occurred during the night following the container's discovery, when Braylon was awakened at his hotel by sounds that seemed to be coming from the direction of Hillcrest Cemetery. The sounds were unlike anything he had ever heard, combining elements of human voices, animal calls, and what seemed to be the grinding of metal against stone. When he looked toward the cemetery from his hotel window, he could see strange lights moving among the headstones in patterns that did not correspond to any natural phenomenon. Over the following days, as Dr. Whitfield arranged for specialized equipment to safely examine the container, both researchers began to notice that they were being followed by something that remained just beyond the edge of their vision. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Electronic equipment malfunctioned in their presence, and both began experiencing vivid nightmares featuring scenes of violence and supernatural horror set in locations that resembled Hillcrest Cemetery. The situation escalated dramatically when Dr. Whitfield's attempt to open the container using non-invasive scanning techniques revealed that it contained something that was still active despite having been buried for over a century. The electromagnetic signatures detected by the scanning equipment suggested the presence of an entity that was aware of the investigation and was actively resisting attempts to examine its prison. When the container was finally opened under carefully controlled conditions, the researchers discovered that it contained the remains of what appeared to be a human being. But the bones showed evidence of deliberate modification that was unlike any known burial practice. The skeleton had been bound with metal restraints and surrounded by artifacts that suggested it had been the subject of a binding ritual designed to prevent its spirit from escaping to harm the living. The historical research that followed revealed that the burial dated to 1847, the same year that Hillcrest Cemetery had been established. Local records from the period contained references to a series of unexplained deaths and supernatural incidents that had plagued the early settlement, until a combined effort by Cherokee spiritual leaders and European settlers had successfully contained the entity responsible for the violence. The individual buried in the container was identified as Jeremiah Blackwood, a settler who had been accused of practicing dark magic and of making deals with malevolent spirits in exchange for power over his neighbors. According to historical accounts, Blackwood had been killed by the community after a series of supernatural attacks that had claimed multiple lives, but his death had not ended the violence. The binding ritual had been performed as a last resort to contain his vengeful spirit and prevent it from continuing to harm the living. The opening of Blackwood's prison had released an entity that immediately began seeking revenge against anyone who had been involved in disturbing its containment. Braylon found himself the primary target of supernatural attacks that escalated in intensity and violence as the days passed. Objects in his hotel room moved without explanation, electronic equipment failed whenever he was present, and he began experiencing physical attacks from an invisible assailant that left him with scratches and bruises that could not be explained by any natural cause. Dr. Whitfield despite her academic skepticism about supernatural phenomena, was forced to acknowledge that they were dealing with something beyond conventional archaeological investigation. The entity that had been released seemed to possess intelligence and malevolent intent, and it was systematically targeting everyone who had been involved in the excavation of its prison. The situation reached a crisis point when other members of the archaeological team began experiencing similar supernatural attacks, and several cemetery visitors reported encounters with a hostile presence that seemed to be guarding the older sections of the burial ground. The entity appeared to be expanding its influence beyond the immediate area of its former prison, suggesting that its power was growing as it remained free from containment. Desperate to find a solution before the situation deteriorated further, Dr. Whitfield contacted Cherokee tribal authorities and local spiritual leaders who might have knowledge of the original binding ritual. The elders she spoke with confirmed the historical accounts of Jeremiah Blackwood's activities and warned that his spirit had been contained using specific protocols that would need to be precisely replicated to restore the binding. The recontainment ritual required cooperation between Cherokee spiritual practitioners and representatives from several Christian denominations whose predecessors had participated in the original binding. The ceremony took place at midnight on Halloween, exactly 175 years after Blackwood's original death, and involved reconstructing the metal container using the same materials and techniques that had been employed in 1847. The ritual was successful in recontaining Blackwood's spirit, but not before several participants suffered supernatural attacks that left them with lasting psychological trauma. Braylon, who had been the primary target of the entity's revenge, required extensive spiritual cleansing and ongoing protection rituals to prevent future supernatural harassment. Following the recontainment of Blackwood's spirit, Hillcrest Cemetery implemented new policies regarding archaeological investigations and metal detecting activities. The area where the binding container had been buried was marked as off-limits to all research activities, and new protective measures were established to prevent accidental disturbance of other potentially dangerous burial sites. Braylon abandoned metal detecting as a hobby following his experience with Blackwood's spirit, recognizing that his discovery had nearly resulted in the release of a malevolent entity that could have caused widespread harm to the surrounding community. He relocated to a different state and changed careers, seeking distance from the supernatural forces that had been awakened by his archaeological curiosity. Our final and most disturbing encounter takes us to Riverside Memorial Park in Louisiana, where 27-year-old maintenance worker Royalty's job cleaning cemetery equipment led to terrifying encounters with shadow people who revealed the location of unmarked mass graves that held dark secrets from the cemetery's past. What began as routine equipment maintenance would expose a conspiracy of silence that had hidden decades of systematic violence against the most vulnerable members of society. Royalty had been working at Riverside Memorial Park for only 3 months when she began noticing unusual phenomena during her late evening shifts cleaning and maintaining the cemetery's landscaping equipment. The cemetery, established in 1923, served the greater New Orleans area and covered 250 acres of low-lying ground that was characteristic of Louisiana's challenging burial environment. Her job involved cleaning mowers, trimmers, and other mechanical equipment after the day shift had completed their work, ensuring that everything was ready for the following day's operations. Riverside Memorial Park had a complex history that reflected the social tensions and racial inequalities of 20th century Louisiana. The cemetery had originally been established as a segregated facility, with separate sections for white and black families, and had served communities that had been systematically excluded from other burial grounds in the region. During the Civil Rights era, the cemetery had gradually integrated, but older sections still bore the physical and spiritual scars of the discriminatory practices that had shaped its early decades. Royalty's position required her to work during the evening hours when the cemetery was closed to visitors, providing her with access to areas of the grounds that were rarely seen by the general public. Her responsibilities included maintaining the equipment storage areas, cleaning tools and machinery, and conducting security checks of the various buildings and storage facilities scattered throughout the cemetery property. During her first month on the job, Royalty began to notice that certain areas of the cemetery seemed to have unusual atmospheric conditions that affected both electronic equipment and her own physical comfort. The older sections of the grounds, particularly those that had been designated for indigent burials during the 1930s and 1940s, seemed to have persistent temperature variations and electromagnetic anomalies that interfered with her equipment and created an atmosphere of unease that she found difficult to explain. More concerning were the subtle visual phenomena that Royalty began observing during her evening shifts. She started noticing movement in her peripheral vision that seemed to indicate the presence of people walking among the headstones. But when she would turn to look directly at the apparent figures, she would see nothing but empty paths and monuments. The movements were too consistent and purposeful to be explained as tricks of light or shadows cast by trees, and they seemed to occur most frequently in the sections of the cemetery that contained older graves from the era of segregation. Royalty initially attributed these observations to normal nervousness about working alone in a cemetery at night, but as the phenomena became more frequent and more distinct, she began to realize that she was witnessing something that went beyond typical psychological reactions to isolated environments. The shadowy figures seemed to be trying to communicate with her, moving in patterns that appeared deliberate and meaningful rather than random. The breakthrough in understanding what she was experiencing came when Royalty decided to follow one of the shadow figures to see where it was trying to lead her. During her shift on a humid September evening, she observed one of the shadowy forms moving consistently toward a section of the cemetery that was rarely visited by maintenance staff or family members. The area contained graves from the 1940s that appeared to be poorly maintained compared to other sections of the cemetery. When Royalty reached the area where the shadow figure had been leading her, she discovered evidence of ground disturbance that suggested the presence of unmarked graves that were not included in the cemetery's official records. The soil in several locations showed signs of having been excavated and refilled, but there were no headstones or markers to indicate what might be buried there. More disturbing was the sheer number of potential burial sites in the area, suggesting that many more people had been interred there than the official cemetery records indicated. Royalty's discovery of the unmarked burial sites coincided with an increase in the intensity and frequency of her encounters with the shadow figures. Rather than remaining at the periphery of her vision, the shadowy forms began appearing directly in front of her, displaying what appeared to be deliberate attempts at communication. The figures seemed to be trying to convey information about the unmarked graves and the circumstances that had led to their creation. The shadow people, as Royalty began to think of them, appeared to be the spirits of individuals who had been buried in the unmarked graves without proper recognition or documentation. Their attempts at communication seemed driven by a desperate need to have their deaths acknowledged and their stories told to the living world. Through gestures and movements that became increasingly clear over time, they began to reveal details about systematic injustices that had been hidden for decades. As Royalty continued to interact with the shadow people during her evening shifts, she began to understand that the unmarked graves contained the remains of individuals who had been victims of institutional violence and neglect during the 1940s and 1950s. The spirits were revealing evidence of a conspiracy involving local hospitals, mental health facilities, and law enforcement agencies that had resulted in the deaths of homeless individuals, psychiatric patients, and members of minority communities whose deaths had been covered up to avoid public scrutiny. The information provided by the Shadow People was detailed and specific, including names, dates, and circumstances of death that royalty could never have known through normal historical research. The spirits seemed to possess complete knowledge of the systematic violence that had been perpetrated against vulnerable populations, and they were determined to ensure that the truth about their deaths was finally revealed to the living world. Driven by a growing sense of moral obligation to the spirits who were trying to communicate with her, royalty began conducting her own investigation into the historical records that might support the claims being made by the Shadow People. Her research revealed gaps in official documentation that corresponded exactly with the time periods and circumstances described by the spirits, suggesting that there had indeed been a deliberate effort to conceal evidence of institutional violence. The investigation that followed royalty's initial discoveries revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that the Shadow People had been trying to expose. Between 1942 and 1958, a network of corrupt officials had been systematically murdering vulnerable individuals and disposing of their bodies in unmarked graves at Riverside Memorial Park. The victims included psychiatric patients who had been subjected to illegal medical experiments, homeless individuals who had been killed to reduce the burden on social services, and civil rights activists who had been silenced to prevent their political activities. The conspiracy had involved officials from multiple institutions, including the State Hospital for the Insane, the New Orleans Police Department, and the Orleans Parish Coroner's Office. The perpetrators had used their positions of authority to identify vulnerable individuals who could be killed without triggering intensive investigations, and they had used the cemetery as a disposal site because they knew that unmarked graves in the segregated sections would never be closely scrutinized by authorities. The Shadow People had been the spirits of these victims, trapped in the cemetery by the injustice of their deaths and their lack of proper burial recognition. Their attempts to communicate with royalty represented decades of effort to find someone in the living world who would be willing to listen to their stories and work to expose the truth about their murders. The revelation of the mass graves led to one of the largest criminal investigations in Louisiana history, involving multiple federal agencies and resulting in the prosecution of several surviving conspirators who were still alive. The investigation also led to significant changes in oversight, procedures for institutions that served vulnerable populations, and to new protections for individuals who might be at risk of institutional violence. The excavation of the unmarked graves required extensive coordination between law enforcement agencies, forensic anthropologists, and community representatives who wanted to ensure that the victims were treated with dignity and respect. The process ultimately recovered the remains of 127 individuals who had been murdered and buried without proper documentation, providing closure for families who had been searching for missing relatives for decades. Each of the recovered victims was given a proper burial with individual headstones that acknowledged their names and the circumstances of their deaths. The cemetery established a memorial garden at the site of the mass graves, creating a space where families and community members could honor the memory of individuals who had been denied justice for more than half a century. Royalty's role in exposing the conspiracy earned her recognition from victim advocacy organizations and law enforcement agencies, but the psychological impact of her extended contact with the Shadow People required ongoing therapeutic support. The experience of serving as a conduit for the spirits of murdered individuals had created lasting trauma that affected her ability to work in isolated environments or deal with situations that reminded her of her supernatural encounters. The case became a landmark in both criminal justice and paranormal research, demonstrating how unresolved injustices could create conditions that allowed spirits of victims to attempt communication with the living world. several academic studies were conducted on royalties' experiences, contributing to improved understanding of how historical trauma could manifest as supernatural phenomena in locations where systematic violence had occurred. The shadow people ceased appearing at Riverside Memorial Park following the proper burial of their remains and the public acknowledgement of the injustices they had suffered. However, the site continued to be monitored by paranormal researchers and spiritual practitioners who recognized the importance of maintaining appropriate memorial practices to prevent similar supernatural manifestations in the future. The conspiracy that was exposed through royalty's contact with the shadow people led to significant reforms in Louisiana's mental health and criminal justice systems, including new oversight procedures designed to prevent institutional violence against vulnerable populations. The case also contributed to national discussions about historical injustices and the need for truth and reconciliation processes that could address systematic violence against marginalized communities. The Memorial Garden, established at Riverside Memorial Park, became a site of pilgrimage for families and community members who wanted to honor the memory of individuals who had been victims of institutional violence. The site also served as an educational resource about the historical injustices that had been perpetrated against vulnerable populations and the importance of maintaining vigilance to prevent similar violations of human rights. Royalty eventually returned to work in victim advocacy, using her experience with the shadow people to help other individuals who had been affected by institutional violence or supernatural trauma. Her story became an important example of how ordinary people could serve as catalysts for exposing historical injustices and ensuring that the voices of victims were heard by the living world. The case at Riverside Memorial Park demonstrated the complex relationship between historical trauma, institutional violence, and supernatural phenomena, showing how unresolved injustices could create conditions that allowed the spirits of victims to seek acknowledgement and justice from beyond the grave. The shadow people had succeeded in their decades-long effort to expose the truth about their murders, providing closure for their families, and ensuring that their deaths would never again be forgotten or ignored by the living world. The investigation and memorial process that followed royalty's discoveries created lasting changes in how Louisiana institutions addressed historical injustices and maintained accountability for past violations of human rights, ensuring that the sacrifice of the shadow people had contributed to meaningful reforms that would protect future generations from similar systematic violence.